University of California Cooperative Extension and University of California Davis Veterinary Medicine is bringing to you a recording from their March 2023 webinar series. This series was co-hosted by University of California Cooperative Extension advisors Tracy Schohr, Grace Woodmansee, Rebecca Ozeran, and specialist Dr. Gaby Maier. Additional resources from this webinar and other cattle health videos can be found at ucanr/sites/rangelands/cattle health. This session is focused on bugging beef, external parasites, with featured speaker Dr. Alec Gerry, a professor of entomology and cooperative extension specialist based at UC Riverside.
So this first slide is really just a signpost for us. It gives us an idea, a roadmap really of where we're going with our presentation. So we're going to talk about the classification of parasites as external parasites and some ways that we categorize and classify them. And it helps us to think about these parasites and their control if we're able to categorize them and put them into categories of their associations with cattle. And then we're going to essentially go into a rogues gallery. So I'll talk about the various ectoparasites of cattle, and we'll discuss their biology and their ecology, and finish off with, as we go through each of those insects and or arthropods, I should say, to include the ticks. We'll also talk about control of those external parasites. And finally, we'll end up on a website that has information on these pests, and in particular has information on insecticides that can be used for their control. So it's a searchable database that any of you are free to use. It's available to the public. You can go in there and search for products that are available for each pest. It also has links to other website pages through the main page that provides information on non-insecticidal options, so things that we would consider more integrated pest management options for these parasites. So what is an external parasite? So that term external parasite throws a lot of people. They don't quite understand it relative to an internal parasite. And I believe the last webinar that you all attended was about internal parasites. So hopefully you'll be able to make some contrasts here. External parasites are insects, ticks, or mites that harm cattle or any animal, but we're talking about cattle today, that harm cattle by feeding either on blood, skin, tissue, hair, or some kind of body exudate. So it could be tears or mucus or other kinds of liquids or fluids that come from the body of the animals. Sometimes we use the term, and I may use the term for external parasite, I may use the term ectoparasite. So that's sort of a shortened term for external parasite. We take the external, make it ecto and parasite, so it becomes ectoparasites. So at the very end, I'm going to bring up some questions we had from the audience and try to answer some of those questions. And I often get a question or two about ringworm. And people ask about ringworm because in their view, it is an external parasite. And it is an external parasite in a sense. It's found on the external portion of the animal body. However, I'm an entomologist, so I deal with arthropods, insects, mites, and ticks. And ringworm is actually caused by a fungus. So it's a fungal infection of the hair and skin. I put a couple of slides in here for you about ringworm. So for those of you who might be interested in ringworm as an external parasite, we'll have a couple of slides here, but I will tell you right now that this is not my specialty. I don't deal with fungi. And so my knowledge on ringworm and ringworm management is a little bit limited, and you probably should contact your veterinarian if you have specific questions about ringworm. What I do know is that ringworm is like many of these fungi, ringworm is transmitted by direct contact among cattle. By the way, people and other animals have ringworm also transmitted by direct contact amongst hosts. Ringworm can be very common in cattle and particularly severe during the winter months. And part of that is because the fungus is susceptible to direct sunlight. And in the winter, we don't have as much sunlight. Cattle tend to crowd together a little bit more, creating more intimate contact between animals. So that increases the incidence of ringworm ringworm, usually in the winter months. So how do you control ringworm? Again, I'm not an expert on ringworm management, but I do know a little bit about it. So primarily, you want to try to prevent it if you can. And prevention is by separating animals that have clear evidence of ringworm. So if they're infected animals, it's best to separate them from other animals so that they're not transmitting the pathogen, the fungus, directly from one animal to another. You can disinfect housing and loafing areas. There are a number of fungal disinfectants that can be applied. These are materials that essentially are sprayed on surfaces that cattle might contact and hopefully then kill the fungus. This fungus, by the way, is a pretty persistent fungus in the environment. So once it's there, it is very hard to get rid of or to remove entirely. Treatment of individual animals that are infected with ringworm. There are topical applications that can be purchased. One of these, for example, is pictured over on the right. That's the fungus fighter. There are a number of other materials that can be applied. Generally, these have chemicals like iodine or phenols or some other antifungal material, and you essentially apply this either as a spray or as a rub-on directly to the area where you see the ringworm, evidence of ringworm. There are ointments. There's one that's pretty well known, used for a number of animals, including humans. It's called Whitfield's ointment, and it's actually a mixture of two acids, benzoic acid and salicylic acid. Salicylic acid, some of you might recognize as the material associated with aspirin. And then there are ivermectins that can be injected subcutaneously in the area of the fungus, and these also work as antifungals. So that's about the limit of my knowledge on ringworm. So we're going to leave ringworm and fungi, and we're going to go back now to the arthropods, ticks, mites, and insects that I do specialize in. So as we think about our classification of external parasites, I'm going to be using a few tables that come from this book. There's a book called The Welfare of Cattle. It was edited by a number of people at UC Davis. I wrote a chapter in that book on cattle ectoparasites in extensive and intensive cattle systems, and I'm going to define what those systems are later on here in the talk. But if you'd like to dig into this, in fact, much of the talk today, if you want to dig into it a little bit further and get more information on the ectoparasites or their association with cattle in these different systems, you can pick up that Welfare of Cattle book. You may be able to find it even online at this point as a PDF, and look for chapter 6. So find chapter 6 and you can really dive into this if you would like. Okay, so first, classification of external parasites. We classify these parasites really into 3 different groupings. The first of those is permanent ectoparasites, and I'm going to talk about what each of these mean in just a moment. So permanent ectoparasites, intermittent ectoparasites, and then temporary ectoparasites. And the name implies really their association with the host animal, with the cattle in this case. So how connected are they to cattle? Are they permanently connected or temporarily connected or somewhere in between? Thinking about permanent ectoparasites, what we're talking about here are insects or other arthropods that basically live their entire life on a single animal. And this is true for cattle lice, as an example. So you see it pictured in the lower left, you see a short-nosed cattle louse and a cow that is infested with lice, and you can see some of the damage caused by the lice in terms of hair loss there. But lice will live their entire life on a single animal, from the female attaching an egg to the hair of the animal, all the way through all the immature stages to the adult stage. All of those stages are essentially on one single animal. So they're permanently associated with their host. They never leave the host. Similarly, there are a number of mite species. This is a Sarcoptes mite. And there are a number of mite species that live on cattle that also live their entire life on a single animal. They have no reason to leave, no need to leave. They'll develop from egg all the way through the adult and make their own eggs all on that same animal. So again, these are permanent ectoparasites. And this becomes important later on when we think about control options, because it's much easier to control arthropods or insects that never leave an animal. If you can control them on that one animal, you can get control often in an area or in a herd, for example, by treating each individual animal. The next grouping are called intermittent ectoparasites. So these are ectoparasites that live part of their life on a single animal and part of their life either on a different animal or off the animal altogether. A really good example of an intermittent ectoparasite are ticks. So you see pictured in the lower left here is a cow with cattle ticks. So this is the tick that causes cattle fever or Texas fever, for example. And then the small tick pictured in the middle part there is a dermacenter tick or a wood tick. I'll talk more about these ticks later on in the talk. So each of these ticks lives for part of its life, at least one stage of its life, on the animal, feeding on blood, and then will drop off the animal at some point, typically to lay eggs in the habitat, in the grasses or the vegetation through which the animals are foraging or moving. So they live part of their life on the animal and part of their life off the animal. And this makes control more challenging because you have two different locations, perhaps, to try to control these ectoparasites, both on the animal and off. Another intermittent ectoparasite would be the common cattle grub. Now, many of us might think of these actually as internal parasites and not ectoparasites at all, because they spend much of their life inside the host, inside the cattle, moving from one location to another, eventually finding their way to the back to form these warbles or bumps that you see on the picture there on the left-hand side on the back of the animal. But the cattle grub actually only lives inside the host, inside the cow, or in association with the cow, during those immature or larval stages. After it's ready to pupate and form the adult stage, it actually pops out of the warble, falls to the ground, and then develops into the adult stage on the ground. The adult fly then, it's actually a fly, and again, I'll show some pictures of this later, but the adult fly then flies up and mates and then looks for a new animal to lay its eggs on, starting the association with the host over again. But there is at least that one part of its life as an adult where it is not associated directly with the animal, does not live on the animal. And then finally, we have temporary ectoparasites. So temporary ectoparasites are those ectoparasites, those insects, primarily flies, many of them are flies, that have very brief contact with the host, usually contacting the host only long enough to acquire a blood meal. So they might land on the animal, take a blood meal, and then they depart and they rest or spend the rest of their time in the environment someplace separated from the animal. These can be some of the most challenging ectoparasites to control, in part because they're associated with the animal for such a short period of time that many animal-specific treatments have trouble reaching the insect pest to get control of the pest. And it's very difficult oftentimes to identify where they're hanging out in the environment when they're off the host. So treating them somewhere else in the environment becomes very challenging. So temporary ectoparasites often are very hard to control relative to the other two groupings. So this is a figure from that textbook. And again, on the left-hand side, you'll see under contact with cattle, you see there are three groupings: the permanent ectoparasite, intermittent, and temporary ectoparasite. And on the right is essentially their association with cattle. So if you kind of put it all together, you can, if you're looking at the right-hand side here, we see that permanent ectoparasites live on the animal, both in their immature and adult stage. So they basically never leave the animal. Intermittent ectoparasites will live with the animal either during their immature stage or during their adult stage, but typically not both. And there's usually a break in between those two. So a break where they're leaving the host. And then temporary ectoparasites can be associated with the animal, with the cattle in this case, at any point through the immature or adult stage, but that association is very brief, and the insect or the arthropod does not stay long in association with the cattle. Okay, so one thing I wanted to mention is that although all of these ectoparasites can be categorized into these three groupings, there are other ways that we think about ectoparasites and their association with animals. One of those is by what kind of impact they have to cattle or to cattle production. And so in this figure over on the right-hand side, you'll see a number of categories of impact. This can be damage, and what we mean by damage is direct injury to the animal. So taking blood, feeding on tissue, causing injury, for example, to cattle. Those will all be forms of damage. Disturbance is the next grouping there. Disturbance could be irritating the animals due to painful bites or due to their presence, for example, in ears, which might irritate the animal and cause the animal to behave in ways it wouldn't normally behave. And of course, that could be bad for cattle production because animals that are not behaving as they would normally may not be feeding as normal. They may not be taking water normally. They may not be resting as they normally would. So it affects perhaps growth and development, meat production or rate of growth. In dairy systems, maybe milk production as well. Impacts can be disease. So a number of these ectoparasites can transmit various pathogens, bacterial or viral pathogens. And so those diseases could impact cattle. And then finally, on the far right, you see nuisance. So nuisance is a sort of a disturbance category as well. But nuisance is a little bit more broadly, I guess, defined as essentially impacting both animals and their caretakers, the human caretakers, by causing some sort of unpleasant, I guess, association. We don't like them, so we spend a lot of time sort of waving our hands or trying to get away from them. And so that might be more of a nuisance. Maybe it doesn't rise quite to the level of an economic cost, but it certainly causes some discomfort of some sort. So this is another way of thinking about ectoparasites and their association with cattle. And this particularly is, I think, useful to think about this association in this way when you're trying to identify which pests are most important to control for your facility or your operation. Those that cause damage or disturbance, or in some cases disease, if disease is known in your geographic region, might be more important to try to get a handle on. Certainly those causing direct damage typically are something people would like to control because it doesn't look good on the animals. The damage doesn't look good on the animals. In some cases can result in secondary infections. And we have a pretty good appreciation that kind of damage can lead to real economic costs or injury. Okay, so I think at this point, I'm going to come back to a comment I made at the very beginning where I discussed that there are sort of two forms of cattle production, if you will. You can categorize them in two very broad categories. One's called extensive and the other is called intensive production. And extensive production is sort of epitomized by the picture on the top of the animals out in pasture, eating grass. So these are where animals are out in some sort of a pasture type habitat, oftentimes interacting with wildlife, maybe deer or other animals that may be moving through these fields that could potentially be carrying parasites themselves. The density of cattle is usually relatively low. Oftentimes they don't have extra feed on site. They're able to forage on their own. So they're simply foraging for food throughout that pasture region. Manure is not managed or handled. The cow pats that are dropped out in pasture are simply left out in pasture to decompose naturally, as in a very natural sort of way. It's often difficult to get out to visit individual animals or treat individual animals, and applying insecticides in particular can be really challenging in such an extensive system. The picture on the lower right, on the other hand, is an example of an intensive system, and we see this more typically associated with dairy operations, and this is where cattle are held in high density. They're often separated from other animals very deliberately. So there isn't wildlife other than perhaps rodents typically moving through these facilities. Density of cattle is very high, so a lot of contact between individual animals, animals of various ages, a lot of connection with the herd managers or the handlers of those animals, and applying materials for control of insects or arthropods is considerably easier given the ability to lock up these animals or restrict their movement in some way. So that's the difference between extensive versus intensive production. And these do have impacts both in terms of the kinds of ectoparasites that we see in these systems, but also how you might manage them. Since this is primarily bugging your beef session, I'm going to make an assumption here that most of you are representing extensive operations, that is pasture type beef facilities. So another way to think about ectoparasites is to think about where the young ectoparasites live, so where they come from. These immature stages are often a target for control. So these are the groups that we might want to try to control in order to reduce the impacts of these parasites on the cattle. And one of the reasons for that is by the time they get to the adult stage of whatever the ectoparasite is, they're perhaps already impacting cattle, already causing damage or economic injury. So we want to usually try to control them when they're still young before they become adult parasites. So if we look over on the left-hand side, I'm going to categorize each of our cattle ectoparasites back to our original categories of permanent, intermittent, or temporary. And we can see that the lice and mites are permanent ectoparasites, meaning that they spend their entire life on cattle, generally associated with the body of the cattle. So where we want to control them then is on the cattle themselves. So the applications, the methods that we're going to use to control them will be applied directly to cattle and the body of cattle. The next group are the intermittent ectoparasites, and you may remember these are the ones that are associated with cattle through some part of their lives, through some good portion of their life, but not all of their life. So they may spend part of their life directly on the animal and part of their life, for example, in the pasture area surrounding the animal. And you can see insects such as the screwworm fly and cattle grub are in that list. All of the ticks fall in that list. And then hornfly, and we'll talk more about hornfly later, but many of you probably recognize hornfly as the fly that sits on cattle, almost like lice. They sit on the cattle most of their life, but they do leave the animal to lay eggs, and the immature stages develop not on the cattle, but out in the pasture. In fact, in decomposing cattle pies or cattle pats is where those hornflies are developing. So the immatures for the hornfly are actually found in fresh cattle feces. As you see, if you follow that row all the way over, you'll see the X under fresh cattle feces. So that would be the place, the best place to try to control hornfly before they can do damage to cattle. Most of the ticks you'll see, if you follow the row over to the right, you'll see that they're generally found in the cattle pasture, or in some cases, if it's an intensive operation, in the cattle pen. So your control would be applied there to the pasture or the pen. And in some cases, for example, the spinosere tick, you might be applying control measures both on the cattle body or in the cattle pasture or cattle pen. So there may be two locations to attempt to affect control. And then the last group are temporary ectoparasites. These are primarily the flies, mostly the blood-feeding flies. And most of these flies are developing and spending most of their immature stage, in fact, all of their immature stage, not associated with cattle, but actually off the cattle, either in manure or other decaying organic material, in the case of stable flies, for example, or even in aquatic sites. Mosquitoes and black flies, for example, develop in ponds and streams, so not associated with cattle or cattle facilities or operations at all, even though the adult would be blood feeding and would be perhaps feeding on cattle. And then finally, you'll see there's that last one called the housefly. The housefly is a ubiquitous fly, cosmopolitan fly found everywhere, develops in all kinds of decaying organic material. Really not a problem in pasture settings, definitely more of a problem in intensive animal production systems, confined animal production systems, mostly due to nuisance, although there's some disease transmission concerns associated with housefly. And we won't talk much about housefly in this presentation. Okay, so now we're going to start our rogues gallery portion of this presentation. And I'm going to talk about a number of the arthropod parasites, their ecology and biology, and then their control. So the first group we want to discuss are cattle lice. There are many cattle lice. I'm showing a picture of 4 of them over on the right-hand side. And we categorize cattle lice into 2 broad groups. The first are chewing lice, and the chewing lice are represented by louse number A there, or indicated as letter A. So that's Bovicula bovis, cattle chewing louse. And you can see it has a real big, broad head. And if you want to think about it, because it's chewing hair and skin, it needs this sort of really big, tough mandibles to be able to do that. So it has this big head to support that chewing action. The 3 other lice, B, C, and D, these are lice we call sucking lice, and that's because they take blood. So they're not chewing on hair or skin. Instead, they're actually sucking blood, more like a mosquito or a flea might be sucking blood. Because of that, they can be responsible in some animal systems, not so much in cattle, but in some animal systems for transmission of diseases. The image on the left shows an animal suffering from louse infestation. And from the perspective of management, we'll treat all of these lice relatively similar, though there are some differences between the chewing lice and the sucking lice in terms of their management or control. So just to give you a little bit of the biology of lice, all lice lay their eggs by attaching them to hairs. If you think about human head lice, and human head lice attach their eggs or nits to the hairs of humans, cattle lice are similar. They attach their eggs to the hairs of cattle. And so sometimes you'll see, in a heavily infested animal, you'll see lots of little eggs, little nits stuck to hairs. Particularly some of the lice that are around the tail head. You can see this really clearly on the tail. So anyway, the lice will lay their eggs on the hair. Those eggs will hatch. They develop through their immature or larval stages to eventually become the adult lice. They mate, lay eggs, and start the process over. Again, never leaving the animal that they're on because they're permanent ectoparasites. Each of the lice species seem to have preferences for the parts of the animal body that they tend to be most commonly found on. So if you look at cattle biting louse, the image of the cattle biting louse in the middle there, you'll see that typically they're associated with the back of the animal, the top line of the animal, whereas other species might be more associated with the neck or the face or the dewlap area of the animal. So the location where you find these lice can sometimes give you an idea of which louse species you're likely dealing with, even if you're not very capable of identifying the lice to species, if you don't have that kind of experience. Of course, if you do find lice and you're able to collect them, you can look at them pretty easily. Most of these lice are large enough to see with the naked eye. And so you can probably look online and try to find an image of the lice to try to identify them. Your veterinarian or local entomologist or animal support personnel can probably assist you with this as well. In terms of controlling lice, lice can be controlled using topical insecticides. And for louse control, and this includes human louse control, by the way, for human head lice, you need to apply insecticides 10 to 14 days apart. And the reason for that is the lice eggs are very resistant to insecticides. So if you make a treatment with an insecticide, using a topical insecticide, a spray or a rub-on or something like that, you very likely will kill all of the immature and adult lice, but you very likely will not kill the egg, the louse egg, or the developing louse inside that egg. And so a week or so later, after you've made your treatment, when the insecticide is no longer effective and at the right concentration, that egg is finally hatching, the new louse is coming out, and you have not enough insecticide left on the animal to actually get control of the lice that have emerged from the egg. So by applying a second treatment 10 to 14 days later, you're actually killing that louse, the lice that came out of that egg, before they're able to reach the adult stage and lay their own eggs. So you're essentially doing a two-time treatment. The first time to kill all the adults, all the stages that are older than the egg stage, and then the second treatment is to kill anything that was in the egg stage during the first treatment, which is now has now emerged and is now an immature or perhaps even adult but unmated louse on the animal. You can also apply ear tags, or in some cases injectable products like ivermectins. Ear tags, the same ear tags you might apply in some cases for hornfly management or management of other flies, will also provide some level of control for lice. They're most effective for chewing lice, however, the ones with the bigger heads. They're less effective for most of the blood-feeding lice. Ivermectins that you might inject as dewormers or for other internal parasites will also kill sucking lice. And so these sucking lice, again, are the blood-feeding lice. So if you can get that dewormer medication or that ivermectin into the bloodstream, you'll kill sucking lice just as you would the internal parasites that you might be targeting with that treatment. So those generally provide more season-long treatment options for you. Continue on. So now we're going to move on from the permanent ectoparasites, and we're going to move into the group that we call intermittent ectoparasites. The first one I want to talk about is cattle grub. I know only one of the group here indicated cattle grub were a problem currently, although I am hearing more and more issues with cattle grubs, particularly in areas where they are practicing organic beef production and organic dairy production as well. So I'm anticipating we're going to start seeing cattle grub return to North America in a way that we haven't seen for a long time. And essentially cattle grub were very nearly eradicated, really because of the use of dewormers and other medications for internal parasites, which kill cattle grub. But if you can't use those products for controlling internal parasites, then you're also not getting control of cattle grub. So we're those of us in the entomology field are expecting cattle grub to have a resurgence in the future here. So cattle grub is also known as the warble fly, and the term cattle grub actually comes from the immature stages, which inhabit, I should say, the body of cattle and produce all the bumps that you see on the image there on the right-hand side on the back of the animal. So those are the immature form of the fly being the warble fly that you see there on the left. Warble flies look very bee-like. They're quite hairy. And so a lot of people, when they see them, if they see them, they think that they're some kind of a bee, maybe a bumblebee. Warble flies don't feed. In fact, they don't even have mouth parts. So their life is very short. They live just long enough to mate and for the female to lay eggs back on cattle to start the whole process again. So the adult stage, which is not associated with the cow, which lives off the cow, is actually a very short-lived stage relative to the immature stage, which lives inside the animal, inside the cow, for the rest of its existence. So talking about that life cycle, if you look on the picture on the lower left there, you'll see eggs of the cattle, the warble fly. So these are the cattle grub eggs. So the warble fly has laid those eggs on the hairs of cattle. And there are different grubs, different species of cattle grubs and different species of warble flies. Each of those species will lay eggs in a different location on the animal. But generally, they all follow a very similar life history process. And so I'm just presenting one life history process for you all here, because I think it gives us the same information regardless of which species of warble fly or grub that you're dealing with. So the adult fly lays its eggs on the hairs of cattle. The fly eggs then hatch. The very small maggot, if you will, of the fly penetrates the skin of the animal and then begins to move internally through the internal spaces of the animal eventually, oftentimes moving through along the spine and eventually moving to the back when it reaches the late maggot stage or the late immature stage. At this point, the now called cattle grub will cut a small hole in the back of the hide of the animal. It's a small breathing hole, essentially allowing the insect to get oxygen, to get air. And it's that breathing hole that we call the warble. So if you think about those holes or those bumps on the back of the cattle, that's the warble. And the warble really is just a small hole that the maggot has cut into the skin, into the tissue, in order to reach the outside air to get oxygen. The larva finishes its development in that warble on the back of the animal. And when it's ready to pupate and form the adult stage of the fly, it pops out of that warble, pops out of that hole essentially, and falls to the ground. And then within a few weeks, the adult fly is emerging from the pupa and starting this process over again. One of the impacts of warble flies that they have on animals is that cattle have this really unusual behavior in response to the flying adult fly. When they hear that warble fly flying, I'm not sure they really understand what the fly is going to do to them, but they have this panicked running response that's called gadding, where they put their tail, the cow will put its tail straight up into the air as it runs with great haste across the field, essentially trying to evade the fly, if you will. And actually, maybe much of the injury to the animal might occur during this gadding process. So the cattle are so panicked that in some cases they'll run into fences, fall into holes, they'll injure legs. And so this gadding behavior that they have is actually quite detrimental from their own health. And I think probably doesn't prevent the fly from laying eggs on them anyway. So it's sort of counterproductive, but it's something that many cattle will do as a response when they hear the flight, the wings flying of these warble flies. In terms of control for cattle grubs, there are a number of products that are on the market that can be used as cattle grub control. Many of these, as I said earlier, are also used as dewormers or other or control for other forms of internal parasites. So many of you may be already using these products to control flukes or other internal parasites. In terms of controlling cattle grubs, if cattle grubs is your target, it's recommended that you apply these products in early fall. And so essentially what you're trying to do by applying the products in early fall is that you're trying to kill the young, immature cattle grub when they're still very small and they've just begun to move through the body of the animal. What you don't want to do necessarily is kill those cattle grubs when they're larger and they've begun moving through more sensitive parts of the body, because if the cattle grub dies in those locations, sometimes they can cause problems for the animal. So in other words, having something die basically inside in some of these internal tissues can cause negative impacts to the animal. So either treat them in early fall, and so you get control of them when the maggots are very, very small, and killing them inside the animal doesn't cause any problems, or wait until the maggots have made their warbles, their holes in the hide of the animal, and they're all along the back. At that point, there are a number of control options for cattle grub as well. There are basically two kinds of controls. There are topical porons that would then essentially move into the body of the cattle. They soak through the skin, get into the bloodstream, and then are circulated through the bloodstream of the animal to kill cattle grub. Or there are injectable products that can be used. So the products you see on the screen here, the Ivomec poron and Ivomec injection, are two examples of products that can be used for control of cattle grub. And again, both products control other parasites, including lice, mites, and a number of internal parasites as well. If you're dealing with multiple internal parasites, you may want to talk to your veterinarian to better understand the right timing for you in terms of when you should apply these materials to get control of the multiple parasites that you might be trying to control with a single product. Okay, we're going to switch over now to talk about ticks. I often get a lot of questions about ticks on cattle. And as it turns out, there are a lot of different species of ticks just in California. And if you include the rest of the United States, it's even more. So more than 50 tick species in California. Any one of them could theoretically be found on cattle. But if you're finding more than just a few or more than one, then that's probably not going to be 50 species of ticks that are of concern to you, but perhaps just a few, maybe a dozen or fewer tick species that are really common on cattle that would readily bite cattle and take blood from cattle. Some of these ticks include the wood tick. So on the far left, you see a male and female wood tick. One of the interesting things about ticks is that they have a different morphology, a different appearance if they're males versus being females. So you'll see the male tick on the far left there, and you'll see it has a little bit of white coloration over the entire body of the tick. And that's because it's got this hardened plate that covers the entire body of the adult male. The adult male will take blood, but it doesn't take a lot of blood. It takes a very small meal. And so it can have this hard plate on its back, and it doesn't need to expand its body to take this big meal. The female tick, so just to the right of that, for example, that female tick doesn't have the hard plate covering the entire back of its body. It's actually got a very small plate or shield that's on maybe the first third of its body. And the lower 2/3 of its body are a stretchable cuticle that, as the adult female feeds on blood, can expand so that the tick actually can become 4 or 5 or more times its normal size. So the adult females can really expand on blood. If you go to the middle tick there, the black-legged tick, you can see that plate. That's a female as well. You can see the plate on the first third much more distinctly relative to the back 2/3 that lacks that plate and can expand. So the black-legged tick is a tick that's well known, I suppose, to transmit Lyme disease, both on the East Coast and on the West Coast for people. So that's a concern for people. The wood ticks over on the left are more typically associated with animals than people. They can transmit pathogens such as Rocky Mountain spotted fever, tularemia, anaplasma, for example, can all be transmitted by wood ticks. And then we have the Spinos ear tick over on the far right. This is a very unusual tick. You'll notice it doesn't have that hard plate at all. And that's because it's a very different style of tick, has a very different life cycle as well. And I'm going to talk about each of these ticks a little bit more in depth as we go through the rest of the slides. And then finally, there's another unusual tick called the pajuelo tick, and that's the far right over there. And you can see, again, it has a very different sort of appearance relative to these other ticks that we're more used to seeing. So let's talk about a few of these tick species and why they're important. So the first of these is the Dermacentor group. And the Dermacentor group, or wood ticks, as I mentioned, can transmit a number of pathogens. They also can cause something called tick paralysis. So these ticks are well known if they're feeding on an animal just in the right spot, usually on the neck or just behind the head. Some of the salivary components, as they inject their salivary components into the animal host in order to keep the blood flowing, some of those salivary components actually interact with the body of the host and can cause paralysis of the host, whether the host is human or cattle or deer or elk, for example. And this has been seen many times in a number of different species of these wood ticks. And what's really fascinating about this is if you simply remove the tick from the back of the neck or from behind the head, or maybe ticks if it's a few ticks, within minutes, usually, the host, the animal host or human host, actually comes back. They come out of paralysis. They're able to walk around and move as normal again. So it's a very short-lived thing that's only occurring while the tick is actually actively feeding on the host. So really fascinating. In terms of control, these ticks can be controlled using acaricides. Acaricides are just insecticides applied against ticks or mites. So ticks and mites are in a group of organisms called the Acari. So we call insecticides for ticks and mites, we call those acaricides. So you can control them with acaricides that are applied to cattle generally in spring and summer. And what you're trying to do is target the nymphal or adult stages of the ticks that might be on the cattle, on the host. Many of these ticks can be controlled to some extent using ear tags. So if you look for ear tags that include ticks on the label, you may be able to get some season-long control of ticks using ear tags. And then finally, for some ticks, there's a method called pasture spelling. And what that means is that you remove the animals from a particular pasture for an entire season. Any ticks, any immature or larval ticks that are in that pasture then will not find a host to feed on, and eventually they will die. They won't live more than usually a single year or part of a year, depending on the tick. And then you can bring your animals back into that pasture, and that pasture should be cleared or cleaned of ticks. So that's pasture spelling. Spinose ear tick is a really interesting tick. So this tick is a one-host tick. It spends most of its life on a single host. And in that host, or on that host, it generally lives in the ear canal. So whether the host is cattle or dog or horse, this tick will find its way to the ear, move into the ears of the animal, and then feed through numerous life stages until it finally drops off as a late stage nymph, drops off the host, and then develops the adult stage on the ground and lays its eggs to start the whole process over again. In terms of damage, primarily the damage from this tick is due to irritation of the animal. You can imagine none of us would probably like having ticks in our ears. And the animals, cattle don't like that either. So they get these ticks in the ear. They can feel them moving and feeding, and it causes irritation to the animal. They spend a lot of time shaking their head or sort of moving their head around. So if you're seeing that with your animals, that they're doing a lot of head shakes or moving the head around in unusual ways, you might look more closely in the ear, as you see in the picture here, to see if you can find any ticks down there in the ear. In terms of control, can be either through application of acaricides, again, insecticides for ticks, or oils applied directly to the ear canal. So you can put materials directly into the ear canal. There are some ear tags now that are also labeled for use for control of spinose ear ticks. So you can look for that on the label of some of the ear tags. Pajuelo tick, this is a soft tick. Soft ticks are very unusual creatures, very different from the ticks that we normally think of as ticks. So these soft ticks will actually feed multiple times in each of their life stages, including as adults. And they take very small meals. They don't take the large meals that you think of most ticks taking. Instead, they take very small meals. Most soft ticks tend to hang out where animals bed down or lay down or rest during the day or at night. So one place we often find ticks like soft ticks would be, in a shaded area around a tree in an otherwise open field or pasture. That's a pretty common place to find this tick. The Pajuelo tick is mostly well known from the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, although there's some areas of the coastal mountain range in California too, where you can find Pajuelo tick. And in terms of damage, this tick is known as the vector or the transmitter of a pathogen that causes epizootic bovine abortion. This pathogen was somewhat recently identified at UC Davis some years ago. And in fact, the folks up at Davis have developed a control method for this tick really recently, a vaccine that can be applied to animals to get control of the pathogen, the epizootic bovine abortion, the pathogen, not the tick per se. Other forms of control are really to avoid tick exposure for about 2 months before breeding cattle. As the name implies, epizootic bovine abortion, the real risk to cattle is that this pathogen caused aborted calves. And so you didn't want to get an infected cow just before breeding season. So cattlemen used to bring their animals out of the Sierra Nevada foothills and down to lowland areas where the tick was scarce or not present, at least for the breeding season, and then they could take the cattle back up after breeding season was done. I want to bring up one last tick, or I want to discuss one last tick very quickly, and that's called the Asian longhorn tick. And the reason I want to bring up this tick is that it was just recently introduced to the United States. In 2017, we found that the first of these ticks on the East Coast. And between 2017 and 2021, this tick either spread or more likely was simply discovered in many of our eastern US states, all the way westward, certainly through Tennessee and into Missouri. So this tick is more widespread now than we thought it was in 2017. And it would not surprise me if this tick continued to spread and move with animals all the way to the West Coast over the next 1 or 2 decades. So we may very well see this tick in the future in California, even though it's not yet known to be here at this point. This tick is important for a number of reasons. The first of those is that it does transmit a few pathogens, and the most important of those pathogens is tuberculosis. And so this is a bacterial pathogen of cattle that can cause real problems for cattle in terms of their morbidity and mortality. And what's really interesting about this tick is that they can reproduce without mating. So a female tick of this species can essentially produce viable eggs, viable offspring without ever encountering a male. In fact, very rarely does anybody ever find males of this tick. Instead, females produce females, and those females will produce additional females. So it's a reproduction basically without any requirement to mate. That makes it very difficult to control this tick because just one female being moved from one place to another is sufficient to start a new infestation. And one of the reasons I suspect that this tick is so rapidly spread in the eastern part of the US. Okay, now we're going to switch over and talk about fly pests. So we're moving from the intermittent ectoparasites to more of our temporary ectoparasites. Although one of these flies, the horn fly, I would really put in the intermittent category because it does spend most of its time as an adult fly, at least, with cattle, associated with cattle. So fly pests are categorized broadly in 2 groups. One is the biting flies, and the other are the non-biting flies. And by biting flies, what I mean are the flies that take blood. So that's the stable fly and horn fly. So these are flies that feed on blood and will bite. And in some cases, in fact, in all cases, I guess, have very painful bites on cattle. And then there's the non-biting flies. These are the face fly and the house fly. These flies will land on cattle and will feed on cattle, but they're feeding on secretions, body secretions, such as sweat or eye secretions or nasal secretions from the animal. So they're not feeding on blood. They're getting proteins and other nutrients from these other secretions. In terms of beef cattle production, really, we're going to be talking about horn fly and face fly, and I'll tell you why as we go through the next few slides. Okay, so biting flies, how do you recognize them? The picture on the left shows horn flies. If any of you have seen large numbers of horn flies gathered on the back of large numbers of flies gathered on the back of your animal or sometimes on the belly of the animal, these are horn flies. So horn flies generally gather, and they can be numbering in the thousands of flies on a single animal. And they usually will gather on the back unless it's a bright sunny day, in which case they will move to the belly of the animal to avoid the direct sun exposure. They don't like the heat or direct sun exposure. But at nighttime or early in the morning, you'll see them gathered generally on the back of the animal. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see stable flies. So in contrast to horn flies, stable flies tend to be found on the lower legs of the cattle, and numbers are generally far less. In this picture, you see quite a few stable flies, but often stable flies number in the dozen to 2 dozen range, certainly not in the hundreds to thousands like you might see with the horn flies. Stable flies also are on the cow just long enough to take their meal, their blood meal, and then they fly off and they leave the animal, whereas horn flies will stay on the animal as adult flies almost all the time. And in fact, if you dislodge the horn flies, they'll fly up in a big cloud and then almost immediately fly right back down, landing on either the same animal or some animal in the very near vicinity of the cow. One of the other interesting things about horn flies is that they will feed on very few other animals. I've seen them feed on horses sort of reluctantly. but they definitely very much prefer cattle. Whereas stable flies, the ones you see on the right-hand side there, will readily feed on a number of animals, to include humans and dogs. So if you're out there in your shorts, with your pasture cattle, you might find that you're getting bitten on the legs, and that would be stable flies biting you, not horn flies. If we do a little blow up here to see the flies a little bit better, on the left, you'll see our horn flies. And horn flies have an interesting behavior that they rest with their head in a downward facing position. So you can see all the flies in the picture on the left there are facing downward. And they hold their wings out kind of in a delta pattern. So if you think of like those delta wing type airplanes, that's what they look like. Very small delta wing airplanes, all with their head facing downward on the animal. Horn flies will feed 20 to 30 times per day. So they take lots of really small meals. Each one of those bites can be relatively painful for cattle. So you may see cattle throwing their tail or throwing their head, or in some cases, kicking the leg up at the belly if the horn flies are on the belly, trying to dislodge those flies. Periodically, you may even see the animals sort of run into another group of animals, hoping to dislodge some of their flies onto their neighbor animals. So some of the cattle fun, I guess, that you might see out there on the pasture. On the right-hand side, we see stable flies, a blow-up of stable flies. And in contrast to the horn flies, stable flies, when they're feeding, will have their head in an upward position. So their head is facing upwards towards the back of the animal as they're feeding. And again, they're feeding on those lower extremities of the cow. And they will feed generally just once, maybe twice per day. They take a larger blood meal. And then once they're done feeding, they fly from the animal, they fly off from the animal, and they rest in the environment someplace. So very different behavior in those two flies. Their development is also very different. Horn flies develop in fresh, intact cattle feces, whereas stable flies develop in old, decaying cattle feces, and especially cattle feces and horse feces, mixed with organic materials such as cattle feed or straw or hay, or some other sort of organic material like that. Because of that, horn flies are often a problem in pasture settings, whereas stable flies generally are not. We don't see that sort of decomposing mixture of fecal material with green waste out in pasture settings. So we don't see as much stable fly issues in pasture production, beef production. There are a number of other blood feeding flies that pasture cattle have to contend with, and these include mosquitoes, black flies, and biting midges. Mosquitoes are known to transmit a number of animal pathogens. They're not a huge problem in California. They will bite animals and they can cause some irritation to the animals. But we don't have diseases right now, at least in California, that mosquitoes are responsible for transmitting to cattle in very large numbers. We do have some concerns with mosquito transmitted pathogens. There certainly are pathogens elsewhere in the world that really impact cattle. So something called Rift Valley fever, for example, if this virus were to be introduced to California, could be a real problem for cattle production, but it's not here now. So we're fortunate in that sense. Black flies and biting midges are more associated with aquatic habitat typically. Black flies are associated with running water, running streams, whereas biting midges are often associated with polluted ponds or marsh-like water, so non-flowing, non-running water. Black flies can be numerous enough to actually cause real issues for cattle in some parts of the United States. We don't generally see them in California in large enough numbers to cause real problems for cattle, but if they are present in very large numbers, they can be painful biters, and their feeding can cause reactions in cattle that can harm cattle. So essentially allergic reactions in the cattle. Biting midges can transmit, they do transmit a pathogen. In fact, a couple of pathogens, one in particular to cattle that's somewhat of a concern called blue tongue virus. And blue tongue virus has been associated with some abortions in cattle. Blue tongue virus is very common in cattle in California, mostly associated with dairy operations because this particular midge develops in very large numbers in wastewater ponds associated with dairies. And so you'll see this mostly in dairy settings, not so much in pasture settings. Moving on to the non-biting flies, and I'm going to talk about these just briefly. There are face flies and house flies. Face flies are aptly named. They like to rest on the face, where they feed on eye secretions and nasal secretions in particular. Face flies, because of this feeding behavior, especially around the eye, they've been associated with the transfer of the bacteria that causes bovine pink eye. And so they can move bovine pink eye from animal to animal. They can also carry nematodes, eye worms, and so they can be responsible for the transfer of eye worms to cattle as well. Houseflies, on the other hand, tend to be associated with animals only in the sense that they may be landing on the animal to feed on sweat or other secretions, and they develop in older, decaying cattle feces. So they're often associated with cattle production, particularly confined cattle production, not so much pasture production, and not so associated with the transmission of these parasites to cattle, but they can be associated with bovine pink eye. So they can feed at the eyes as well and also transfer the bacteria that causes bovine pink eye. We're not going to talk about houseflies much more than this at this point, because houseflies are really a confined animal issue, and face flies, on the other hand, are more of a pasture cattle issue. So thinking about these face flies, like horn flies, develop in intact manure pats, cattle pats, and so they require fresh cattle feces and intact pats for development. And this is why we see them in pasture settings relative to house flies, which develop in settings that are very similar to stable flies. So thinking about control for pasture flies, since we're talking about beef cattle in this webinar, we're going to focus on control for horn flies and face flies. And so we're going to ignore stable flies and house flies here. So thinking just about those pasture flies, the horn flies and face flies, generally the best time to target control is spring through fall. That's when these flies tend to be most abundant. The adult flies, that is, tend to be most abundant. They can be controlled through using feed-through products. So these are materials that you feed to the cattle. Many of these products have growth regulators in them, things that will get into the cattle feces and prevent the immature fly, the maggot, from completing its development to the adult stage. Some examples of some of those growth regulators are diflubenzuron and methoprene, and you might know them by trade names such as Clarifly and Altocid. There's lots of different formulations. You talk to your feed store owners and they can give you all kinds of suggestions and ideas for materials that are available locally to you that have these growth regulators in the feed or mineral block. Both flies can be controlled to some extent using ear tags. Some people call ear tags fly tags, so that's another name for them. So these are the tags that the cattle will wear in their ears. These tags can be treated with insecticides or impregnated with insecticides, and then they slowly release the insecticide to the animal, sort of like a flea collar for a cat, in a very similar way to the way a flea collar would release insecticide to control fleas on cats. So these ear tags are particularly effective for controlling hornfly, although there's a lot of resistance now in hornflies to the insecticides that are used in some of these ear tags. So if you're not getting control, you may have to try a different ear tag that has a different chemical, a different chemical class. So talk to your supplier about chemical classes and which class you should use if your own ear tags are no longer working for control of hornfly. Face fly are more challenging to control with ear tags. So most ear tags simply say that it provides suppression, but not control of face flies. And similarly with lice, most of these ear tags can provide some control of lice, especially the chewing lice. Ear tags will last 3 to 5 months. So you want to put them on while they're still effective. But then when the season's over, as the insecticide begins to wear off on those ear tags, those tags should be removed from the animal so that you're not giving the insects, or you're not exposing the insects to sublethal doses of the insecticide, because that just helps create more resistance. So we don't want to do that. You can also use dust bags or back rubbers, and these essentially are canvas bags or canvas tubes that are filled with insecticides, usually some kind of a dust. And insecticides could be things like Coumaphos or permethrin. And these back rubbers essentially, or dust bags, the animal walks underneath it or walks next to it and essentially treats itself. These chemicals usually also control cattle lice and ticks, so they can be useful for that as well. And then there's a sort of an interesting thing that was created in North Carolina State some years ago, and it's called the cow vac. It's a big vacuum that animals will walk through, and essentially it sucks off the horn flies and face flies that animals might have. And I had a video on the next slide, but in this, to save us some time here, I'm not going to show it. But if you'd like to show it, you can just Google cow vac, or if this webinar is made available to you later on, you may be able to go and get the link from the webinar and watch the video of cows walking through the cow vac. It's actually quite fascinating to see, and it works very well, but it's very expensive. So something to keep in mind there. So we're going to skip that video. Let's move on. We just have a few more slides to finish off here before our 7 o'clock time. So this next slide really is discussing the effectiveness of control. And the purpose for this figure is to explain, or I guess to give some encouragement to all of you that if you look for ways to manage these pests, you can actually manage them and get some economic benefit. So if we ignore the intensive systems over on the right and we look just at the columns that say extensive systems in the middle, you'll see that there's 2 columns, active management and no management. And the number of X's in each of the cells indicates the impact of the ectoparasite to cattle. So just looking at lice, for example, if lice are not managed, lice can have a very high impact on the animals, very high economic impact to the animals, or health impact, I guess, to the animals that could result in economic costs to producers. But if they're managed, actively managed, we can reduce that impact somewhat. So from 3 X's essentially to 2 X's. These are relative changes. In some pests, for example, screwworm, under a no management option, screwworm can be very damaging to cattle, but under an active management option, which includes the quarantine that we have in the US against screwworm, we see that we can reduce their impact greatly. So some of these pests our targeted measures for control can really have dramatic impacts and result in great cost savings for us and much better health for the animals as well. So hopefully what you can see is that most of the pests that have high impacts, that have more than 1 X on the no management option side, if you apply one of these management techniques that we've talked about, you can reduce that impact of the parasite and therefore improve animal health and welfare. A few insects are very difficult to manage. So if you look down towards the bottom, you'll see biting flies and black flies, for example. Very difficult to manage these. And so there isn't really an active management option for those pests. And for that reason, you see no difference between the no management and the active management side. So those would probably be pests I would recommend not spending a lot of time and money trying to get control of. Okay, I want to finish off by letting you all know that we do have a resource that you can use. And this is called the VetPestX pesticide database. It's an online database. The website is down below there. You can use this. You feel free to take a picture of it if you'd like, if you're looking at the screen. You can use this database. It's open to the public. It allows you to search by state that you're in and by animal that you would like to apply a material to and by pest you're trying to target to see which insecticides are registered in your state for control of that pest on that host animal. It's getting a lot of use now, and a lot of the extension folks throughout the US are using this. We created this at UC Riverside a few years ago, but we actually now have it on our national website, the veterinarentomology.org website. So I would encourage you, take a picture of that slide if you would. And if you'd like, go to that website down at the bottom, and you can do your own search and find materials that you think would be appropriate for you. I will finish off that discussion by saying, do make sure that you read the label and that the label indicates that that pest is appropriate for that material, and make sure you're using it as the label indicates you should use it. Okay, We're going to finish off by trying to review some of the questions that were submitted by participants prior to the webinar. And I've just got 3 slides here. I think it's 3 slides, maybe 4 slides of questions, and I've organized them by groups. So all of the questions that came in, if they were related, I put them onto a single slide to try to answer them at one time. And I think we've actually answered all of these already, but we're just going to review them to make sure. So our first slide indicates questions related to ringworm management, ringworm control. And just a reminder, as we discussed, ringworm is a fungus, so it's not an ectoparasite in the sense that I work with. It's not an insect or a mite or a tick. It's instead a fungus transmitted directly from direct contact from animal to animal. It can be treated with a number of antifungal topical products that are available on the market. You can probably get those from feed stores or farm stores. In terms of prevention, best to separate infected animals, and you can disinfect facilities before winter, because winter tends to be the time where ringworm is most common. So if you can disinfect before winter, you get the most bang for your buck. Okay, question group number 2 was focused on lice. So thinking some of you mentioned that lice are getting harder to control, and wondering if there is resistance perhaps in lice, and whether that's a problem in California, or there are other products out there that maybe would be more effective. So one of the problems may be that that folks aren't treating the lice twice. If you remember to our discussion of lice need to be treated 10 to 14 days apart. So if you treat them just one time, you will kill all the lice. We don't know of any resistance issues with lice. So you'll kill, or at least not severe resistance issues. So you will kill the lice, but you won't kill the egg stage. And so those eggs will hatch and the animals will be reinfested by the eggs that were already on the animal. So do make sure that you treat 10 to 14 days apart. So one treatment, wait a week and a half or so, apply it, the same treatment a second time to kill the newly emerged lice. Ear tags may not work for lice control, particularly for sucking or blood feeding lice, the ones that actually take blood and not chewing lice. So if you're using ear tags to get lice control, that may be why you think you see resistance. Those ear tags just are not that good at controlling the blood feeding lice. And then if you're really having some trouble getting control, you might want to try some of the injectable products like ivermectin. If you have sucking lice or blood feeding lice, these ivermectin products, the same ones you'd use for other internal parasites, will actually kill sucking lice as well. So you might talk to your veterinarian about a product that you would use to kind of get double control, internal parasites and sucking lice.
So Alex, on that, there was one question that was asked that relates to this online. It says, during the last webinar about internal parasites, we were told not to overuse ivermectin because the parasites become resistant to it. What is your advice on how they deal with that?
That's a great question. And I'm not as familiar with a lot of the flukes and nematodes and worms, the other internal parasites, for example, and their level of resistance to ivermectin. I don't know of lice that are resistant to ivermectin, but this is probably a good reason to talk to your veterinarian, because if there are issues with ivermectin resistance to the other internal parasites, then this may not be a strategy that you want to pursue, because while you might get control of lice, you may be making things worse for control of those other parasites. So talk to your veterinarian, and if that's a concern, then look for one of these other louse control options that is not that doesn't use ivermectin. There are still a number of louse control options. Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, this next group of questions really talks about treatments for parasites generally, and particularly for grubs and warbles. So treatment for cattle grubs and lice is best done in the fall, especially if you're trying to time them together. If you're using some of those materials that will be systemic, you want to apply those materials in the fall to kill the cattle grubs when they're very, very small, very young. And you're also getting control of lice before the winter time, where most louse species actually are more numerous on the animals. Many of those products are useful for deworming. So that goes back to the question we just had. Again, talk to your veterinarian for more specific guidance if you're trying to do multi parasite control with single treatments because there might be some impacts. It may be impacts I'm not even familiar with, for example, the resistance issue with internal parasites. You can apply topical insecticides or even inject locally ivermectins just underneath the skin near the warbles to kill grubs in the warbles. But honestly, at that point, the hide damage has already occurred on the animal. And so you don't even need to apply insecticides if you don't want to. You can either, if you feel like it, squeeze each of those grubs out, you kind of pop it like a pimple, or you just allow them to emerge naturally and fall to the ground, and hopefully you get control the next year after they've laid their eggs and their whole cycle starting again. You can get control in the fall when the young grubs are beginning to move through the cattle body. And then last slide here. So what can we use for fly control other than fly tags, and how do you prevent parasites besides using insecticides? First of all, fly control varies with the species of fly. So the two flies that are pasture flies, that's the hornfly and the face fly, these can be dealt with in some regard using feed-through insecticides. So materials that you feed to the animals, that animals then incorporate that into their fecal material, and in the feces, the flies that lay their eggs there, the eggs can't develop correctly, the immatures can't develop correctly because of the insecticide that's in the feces. So that's a feed-through insecticide, works for both hornflies and face flies. Hornflies can be controlled relatively effectively still with ear tags. You just have to be careful which ear tags you're using and where, what kind of resistance pattern you might have with your hornflies. Hornflies, as I said earlier, have developed resistance to a number of insecticides. Hornflies can be controlled with insecticidal sprays. Face flies can be controlled with insecticidal wipes, so you don't have to spray a whole body necessarily for face fly control. Maybe you just do an insecticidal wipe around the face. Obviously, most of you, if you've got large beef herds, you're not going to be out there treating every cow's face with an insecticidal wipe. So in that case, you might want to go through the feed-through or even an ear tag option with face flies. And then obviously for face flies, maybe the bigger concern is really the transmission of the pathogen pink eye or eye worms. And so you can do treatment if you start seeing those issues in your herd. Stable flies and house flies, these are really ectoparasites or parasites associated more with intensive cattle production. So dairies, for example, confined animal feedlots. And we won't really talk about them much. Well, we didn't talk about them much, and I'm not going to talk about them here either. Control for them is very difficult because of their lack of association really with the animals. And then in terms of non-insecticidal options, there are physical options for controlling most of these ectoparasites. For lice and mites, you can separate infested animals from non-infested animals so that they're not transferring those parasites. For hornflies and face flies, breaking up manure pats in some way, if you can take that fresh manure and break it up, that will prevent development of those flies. So that would be a physical control. For ticks, if you remove the animals from a pasture for a season before putting them back in, that pasture spelling is a physical control that will result in death of the ticks. There are a lot of botanical oils and repellents that are coming on the market. Many are on the market already. Many more are working their way through the system and should be on the market pretty soon. One thing about the oils and repellents is that many times they are not reviewed or approved by EPA. And so efficacy is really pretty hit or miss. So you can try those. If they work for you, great. If they don't work for you, perhaps move on to try something else. And we don't really have a good idea yet which botanical oils and repellents are going to work for which group of parasites. So
Dr. Gerry, on that comment about the efficacy, we did have a question. Has there been any studies as to the effectiveness on poron fly repellents, or is that something that we could maybe follow up with folks after this session if you don't have something off the top of your head for that?
So another great question. There are a number of efficacy studies for porons that are insecticidal porons. So if you're talking about permethrin or organophosphate insecticides, lots of efficacy studies there. In fact, to get EPA registration for those products, they must show efficacy against the pest that's being targeted. But if you're talking for botanical oils and repellents, because these don't go through an EPA registration process, they don't have a lot of efficacy studies behind them. There are a few studies out there. The studies that are out there, including a few that we've done down here at Riverside, those indicate that these oils and repellents will work. They're effective for about 24 to 48 hours, maybe as much as 72 hours, after which they lose their efficacy. So if you're going to use these methods for management of insects, you often have to apply them very regularly, repeatedly over time to get any real level of control. So very hard to do in a pasture setting, much easier to do in an intensive cattle production facility.
So building on that theme, is there any hornfly insecticide resistance?
Yes. So hornflies are well known to be resistant to synthetic pyrethroids, to organophosphates, to a lot of the chemicals that we've been using for about 20 or 30 years that we've been putting into ear tags. Hornflies have developed considerable resistance to those materials. There are newer there are newer ear tags that are on the market now that have other products, other materials to which hornflies are not resistant yet. But because of the way that those ear tags are used and the fact that hornflies stay on those animals all the time, the opportunity for resistance development in hornflies is just really large. And so even as we develop new materials and put those into new ear tags, I expect that we'll see resistance to those materials pretty quickly as well, just as we have in the past with other products. So hornflies are a real challenge and will be a real challenge for the future as well.
So on that, we had a case-specific question on hornflies. So how far does a hornfly fly? So if my neighbor is within 300 yards and has 25 pair on 11 acres, somewhat of an intensive stocking, with no treatment or management of parasites, will they affect my herd?
So short answer is yes, at that distance, yes. So there was a couple of studies done at North Carolina State University some years ago, and they looked at hornfly dispersal flight to find animals. So those hornflies are developing in the manure pats, but if the herd departs, and if you think of sort of a natural system of cattle moving over in the wild, I guess, if you think of wild cattle, they're pooping all over and then they leave, and those hornflies are developing in the feces. And when they emerge, the cattle have already moved on. So they have to have the ability to fly, to disperse, to find those animals. And they will fly at least up to a quarter mile or so to find animals. So if they emerge and there are animals all around them, they probably won't go very far. They'll just go to those nearest animals. But if they emerge from a manure pat and there are not animals nearby, they will fly off until they hopefully discover an animal. I have seen a cow in particular. They're very specific in terms of feeding on cows. Although I have seen horses with hornflies if a horse facility is adjacent to cattle production. So they will feed on horses to some extent as well.
Great. There are a few clarifying questions, transferring a little bit to warbles. Are the warble fly also called the heel fly?
Yes, good question. Yeah, they have many of these insects and arthropods have multiple names. And this is true for the warble fly as well. So it is also called the heel fly. And that's because as the fly flies towards the animal, it attempts to land on the lower leg of the animal where it's going to lay its eggs. So it will land on the heel, if you will, of the cow. So yes, the same group of flies. The warble flies are also heel flies.
And another question on that one or statement is about, I haven't seen warbles since I was a teenager in the 70s. Are they the same as the bot flies that lay yellow eggs on my horse's legs and chest?
Same basic lifestyle, but a different species of fly. So the ones that lay their eggs that you see on the horse, that's a horse grub, if you will, as opposed to a cattle grub. So different species. The cattle grub specifically lives in cattle, and these horse grubs specifically live in horses, but they have a very similar life history. They lay their eggs on the hairs of the animal. They then penetrate the body of the animal. In the case of the horse might actually lick the eggs and swallow them. But in any case, they enter the body of the animal, go through their development, and until they leave the animal to become the adult fly on the outside. So different species. The horse grubs will not infest cattle, and cattle grubs will not infest horses, but very similar life history between the two.
Perfect. For those of you still on, we have a handful of questions, so we'll try to get through these really quick with everyone. The next one I'm going to give to Dr. Maier, and it is going back to the question on the Parejo tick is if females are exposed as young calves, do they develop a resistance to foothill abortion?
Yes. So yes, as soon as they get infected with the pathogen, they should develop resistance. So as young calves, I am not entirely sure, and there could be some maternal antibody interference where they may not develop their own resistance. I can't vouch for that completely. We actually have, I want to refer to our webinar from last year. So we had an entire webinar on this topic that's available on the same webpage, right, as this series will be hosted. So I refer you to that one. The problem with exposure to the ticks is that we don't know, even if they're exposed to the tick, we don't know how many of those ticks are actually infected. So not all of those pajarradio ticks have the pathogen that causes foothill abortion. It's only, I don't know, 20% or so. The other problem is that you won't see the ticks on the cattle. They only feed for a short period of time. So it's just, it's really hard to gauge whether your calves have been exposed, have been infected. It's just, there are a lot of unknowns.
Thank you for that. So we'll switch back to lice now. There was a question about lice specifically being able to transfer to humans and dogs, and I guess in general, another question about just the general parasites that you've covered. What is that ability to transfer to humans or horses or dogs?
So that's a great question. Most of these parasites are very specific to cattle. They will not transfer to humans or to other animals. Lice in particular are very host specific. So cattle lice are cattle lice. They will only live on cattle. They may, for a very short period of time, attempt to live on something very closely related to a cow, but they certainly wouldn't live on people. And we humans, we have our own lice that live only on us, our human body lice or our head lice that wouldn't live on other animals. Most of these other parasites, similarly, are very specific to cattle. The few things that are not, that would feed on humans in addition to cattle, would be things like the stable fly, which is willing to take blood from cattle, dogs, humans, and other animals. Many mosquito species will bite multiple animals. And many of the ticks that we talked about will feed on or bite, in addition to cattle, they'll bite other animals, in some cases, including humans. But those that we categorize as permanent ectoparasites, so the lice and the mites, they tend to be very specific for the hosts that they're on. They have to be on that particular host.
Great. So we have two more left. The first one, are there any IGRs that can help with lice?
IGRs that help with lice? Not that I'm familiar with. No, I don't know of any IGRs that I can think of right now that we use for control of cattle lice or human lice for that matter.
Perfect. And this is a two-part question, and so we'll see which ones you want to answer if you want to throw part of it to Dr. Maier as well. Is there any tick control for pregnant cattle? And also, is there any feed-through fly control for pregnant cattle, and is it safe?
Yeah, maybe Dr. Maier, if you want to take that in terms of the pregnancy aspect, because I'm not sure that, well, let me just start by saying EPA registers insecticides, and they do pay attention to whether you have lactating or pregnant or young animals. So sometimes the registration is different for these different animals. So if you look at the registration or at the label of the product, it should tell you if there's an animal life stage that you can apply it. It'll tell you what that life stage is. But yeah, I'm not as familiar with what the needs are in terms of pregnant animals. So I'll turn that over to Dr. Maier, and maybe she can try to address that.
Sure. Yes, I mean, in general, always check the label, regardless of what you're using. For the feed through, I can't really think of a way that would interfere with a pregnancy, because it is designed to go through the cow. It's not supposed to actually act within the cow. So it's not supposed to kill parasites within the cow. It's supposed to kill the larvae that are in the manure. So I'm pretty sure that the feed through should be okay. It's also, I know it's used extensively in dairies, and dairy cattle don't really have a breeding season, so most of them are pregnant at any one point. So I'm pretty sure that the feed through should be okay. Tick control in pregnant cows. I can't also really think of any product that should be a problem with pregnancy. The only product that I'm aware of that is can interfere with pregnancy is valbazen, which is for internal parasites. That can cause abortions within the first 3 months. That's the only one that comes to my mind. But again, always double check the label.
Well, one thing as a follow-up here that all the folks that are on this webinar may be interested in, I just heard this about a week ago. EPA and FDA are making agreements about who is going to be responsible in the future for insecticides and acaricides. And in the past, anything that was targeting an external parasite, so not a liver fluke or some kind of internal parasite, that was managed by EPA. So all of these insecticides that we've discussed, feed throughs and everything else, was managed by EPA and handled by them. And the FDA dealt with things like ivermectins and avermectins that might be injected, for example, for internal parasites. But I understand this may change. FDA wants control over all of the materials that would be applied to an animal. So leaving EPA only with control of products you might apply to your facility, to structures, for example. So this is going to be a big change if it does happen, because the FDA screening process is much more laborious, much more rigorous, time-consuming, and costly for people that are trying to produce these materials than the EPA process. So this is going to be a huge change for us in the future if it goes through.
Thank you to Dr. Gerry for sharing your knowledge on identification, treatment, and prevention of external cattle parasites. During the video, there were references to other webinars. You can find recordings of those sessions on this YouTube channel. Thank you for watching this webinar recording that was brought to you by the University of California Cooperative Extension and University of California, Davis Veterinary Medicine, and was co-hosted by University of California Cooperative Extension advisors Tracy Schohr, Grace Woodmansee, Rebecca Ozeran, and specialist Dr. Gaby Maier.